Hello and welcome to the next session entitled How to Save the Planet and Rethink the Global Economy. I'm speaking, of course, with Mark Carney, best known to many of you as the former governor of the Bank of England, who's also now the UK government special advisor on climate policy ahead of COP meeting in November. But he has just produced a new book. His first book is a complete doorstopper, I should say, which has his bio at the back, and it takes up an entire page because he's had so many extraordinary roles. He was formerly the governor of the Central Bank of Canada. He was chairing the Financial Stability Board. He was, of course, formerly at Goldman Sachs. And he's now on a series of private sector boards, such as Brookfield Asset Management and, of course, Stripe, that fintech company, which has been in the headlines recently for its extraordinary valuation. So an amazing portfolio of roles and perspectives. And I'm sure all of you watching have a lot of questions you'd like to ask him. So I should start by saying, if you want to ask questions, please go ahead and start doing so now. They will be sent to me and I'll try and weave them into the discussion as we go, because it's very helpful for me to know what you, the audience, really want to hear about. But we're here today, first and foremost, because Mark has got this book out called Values, Building a Better World for All. It's a remarkable book for two reasons. Firstly, because it lays out a very strong plea for us to rethink economics, not just climate change, which is an area he's talked a lot about, but to rethink economics much more broadly and how we do policymaking. Some people who've done reviews of the book have said, well, if he feels all that, why didn't he talk about that when he was governor of the Bank of England? How can he talk about the perils of becoming too marketized or treating everything as a commodity, given he's worked at Goldman Sachs and is now holding private sector roles? But it is a strong manifesto for what he thinks we should be looking at today in economics. The second thing that's even more remarkable about the book is that Mark wrote it himself. Newsflash to all of you who are readers and watchers of public policy figures, very few international public policy figures these days actually write their books completely by themselves. Most of them use ghostwriters either overtly or covertly. But Mark tells me he actually typed every single word of this doorstopper himself. Is that true?
It is true. It is true. Therefore, all the errors are definitely mine, including any typos.
Well, I must say, someone who's just finished my own book, I am impressed. I feel a lot of sympathy for you for having done it. It's not an easy job, and it is a remarkably good read. But let me start by asking the quick, obvious question: why now? Why did you decide to write this book now? Is there something fundamentally broken about the market economy that you think needs to be fixed urgently?
Yeah, and I'll pick up on a tiny bit in your introduction. I did talk about some of these issues when I was governor on inclusive capitalism, the motivation for a number of the financial reforms, and also elements of what we need to do to address climate change and sustainability. But obviously, I'm constrained in my role to focus on the mandates that I had, and rightly so. I also was constrained in time. And as you know from the books you've written and the one you're just finishing up, it takes a lot of time to write a book, and you need some free space to actually gather your thoughts. And I really did feel, to get to the heart of your question, that I was basically a governor during a series of crises. I started at the start of the financial crisis in 2008. I finished literally at the start of the worst bits of the COVID crisis, handed on to Andrew Bailey, and thank God I was handing on to Andrew Bailey in that regard with the COVID crisis. And I wanted to step back and look at, well, are there some common drivers of these crises? And I did feel that getting this balance between value in the market, the role of the market, and the values of society, you have one extreme, which in the run-up, and you know this well, Gillian, run-up to the financial crisis is sort of market fundamentalism, markets built on markets. You probably understand the derivative markets better than anybody that built up pre-crisis, and the consequence of that, that ultimately was a fatal flaw in the markets and affected values of society, and of course affected economics. On the other end of the extreme, actually, we can use values of society to harness the power of market, and that's the more optimistic end of the book, which is what we're trying to do with climate change, because it's becoming clearer and clearer that people want this addressed. Given that there's a hierarchy of values, let's get to sustainability, let's get to net zero. How do we then organize the system so the market is pushing in the right direction?
Right. Well, it's interesting because last year we saw an extraordinary ESG boom. I've written a lot about that as part of the Financial Times This Moral Money platform. I think we're beginning to see the start of quite a significant backlash, which is inevitable. When you have a boom, you always have backlash. Are you concerned, though, for example, about greenwashing, that under the mantra of a lot of ESG commitments, there's actually a lot of greenwashing by companies? Do you think there needs to be, say, mandatory climate disclosures, regulation imposed on companies
Yeah.
right now to stop them greenwashing? And I ask that question partly because I see already we're getting a flood of questions through, so thank you to the audience, and they're all about climate change. So that's one question. Do we need mandatory regulatory action to stop greenwashing?
Yes, we do. And that's one of the objectives for COP26, for example, on disclosure. Listen, 5 years ago, you know this well, a number of the audience will know this well. 5 years ago, climate disclosure was a concept. The TCFD was just being brought together again as a concept. It took 2 years to get those standards promulgated. And then we've had a couple reporting rounds. Now, the application of those standards is uneven. It's getting better, but it's uneven. And part of the reason it's uneven is there's still a panoply of other disclosure standards that are out there. There's a learning that's happening, and also it's not yet mandatory. Now, credit to the UK. The Chancellor announced back in November that the UK will make it mandatory. 4 other countries have followed with that. We now have a process through the IFRS, which potentially will cover 140 countries. But one of the core objectives for COP26 is to get all countries, certainly all G20 countries, to have pathways to make this mandatory so that the market has consistent, comprehensive, and comparable climate disclosure. I would say, if I can take a step back, though, to your general point or your general challenge and right challenge on greenwashing. Look, I think the good news is this elements of the system are coming into place. Disclosure, reporting at the heart, better understanding on risk management, elements of markets that we need, new markets like offsets and others, but also net zero plans, not just for companies, but for financial institutions. However, the question then becomes about execution and assessment of that execution. And that's where the strength of the market comes into play. And like any big movement, any big secular trend, there is good and bad. There's people who can execute and those who can't. And it's the job of the market and the job of broader stakeholders to make those judgments with that information. And some will fall short, that's absolutely right, but that's the sifting that happens in the market, and the good will be backed with capital and the bad will be shunned, and that's how we can make progress.
So you'd like mandatory carbon disclosure, and you want that
Absolutely.
to be one of the COP26 goals, which, by the way, is a pretty tough message for a lot of companies to hear. Should that be applied to small and medium-sized enterprises as well as big ones, do you think?
Well, yeah, great question. You need proportionality. You start with public companies, but importantly, you include in those public companies pools of capital. So big asset owners, asset managers such as private equity firms having TCFD type disclosure, they have the resources in order to do this and to aggregate up, provide that disclosure. Clearly, it's not a requirement, or it is not an immediate nor ultimate, I think, requirement for small, medium-sized enterprises. This is, we're not going to have scenario analysis of small, medium-sized enterprises, but for the system as a whole, since the movement is increasingly towards Scope 3 disclosures, so as you know, but just for the benefit of everyone, up and down the value chain, so including suppliers, then you get alignment of bigger companies with their suppliers to help get that information, provide that disclosure, and align incentives and squeeze out carbon across the value chain.
So we have another bunch of questions here, which is very interesting. I mean, you talk about proportionality in terms of big companies, small companies. What about the developing world versus the emerging markets? Do we have to basically accept a situation where essentially to get net zero, the Western world has to change the way it lives immediately? I mean, and actually quite radically, but essentially accept that it's going to take a while for the emerging markets to change how they live? Should we be cutting India, for example, a bit of slack?
Well, a couple of things. First is that the objective for truly inclusive and fair globalization is, I would reframe it slightly and raise the bar, if you will, which is the objective is that emerging and developing countries come up to our standards of living. So that means that our carbon footprints need to come. That's part of the reason why our carbon footprints need to come down so significantly, because we need to have society, we need to have our energy demand and our energy production and our other emissions consistent with the world rising to a higher level, including India, as you say. And so part of that is being made possible through advances in renewables technology, not just technologies, but the applications across wind, solar, and others. But that needs to happen more broadly. It needs to happen in the hard to abate sectors such as cement. You think about, we add New York City every, I forget the exact figure, but it's a virtue of, a couple of months or something like that. I think it's 40 days is that in terms of urbanization. Well, that's a lot of cement, that's a lot of steel. And those breakthrough technologies, to use Bill Gates's terms, need also to be developed. Now, I think there is a much greater appreciation in the market of those two aspects. First, the huge amount of capital turnover for currently economic zero carbon technologies like wind, solar, storage, others. And that's a big job to build that out and reorganize the economy, but it can be done. But also a swathe of technologies that need to happen, including things like direct air capture and the others that I've mentioned, that are more venture capital or at best growth equity type investments. Now, fortunately, we have that spectrum of activity in the or capabilities in the market, but now there's more and more of a focus on it. And to flip it around, a huge, some people see that as a problem, others see that as a huge opportunity, because that will be incredibly valuable, because that's ultimately what society needs.
Right. Are you in favor of, say, a carbon price, carbon tax? Is that something you're going to be pushing for COP26 to adopt as well? And would you introduce mechanisms to help poorer people and redistribute the carbon tax?
Yes, yes and yes to your question. I mean, one of the objectives for COP26 in policies is a price for carbon and also an end to fossil fuel subsidies across the world. I mean, it's numbered in the hundreds of billions of dollars still. And in terms of carbon tax or carbon price design, in my judgment, for example, here in Canada, judgment elsewhere, is the value of, it is a regressive tax unless you redistribute the proceeds. I lead someone in my position will have led a more carbon intensive than average lifestyle with travel and other things. But the redistribution on average, for example, in Canada, makes whole or more than makes whole about 70% of the population. Only the relative price changes. And I think that is necessary in order to have an effective carbon tax. Last point, of course, is not carbon tax and do nothing else. It's one policy amongst many.
Well, of course, with Janet Yellen having co-written a report with you calling for many of these things earlier, and of course she's now Treasury Secretary in the US, that's going to add an extra dimension or an extra element of momentum to all this. One other quick question, and then I'm going to turn to some wider questions, which again, just following through the questions we're getting from the audience here, is what are your views on the EU green taxonomy? Because we're seeing people saying it's way too rigid, way too backward looking to be effective. It's going to be a whole swathe new, if not red tape, then green tape that's going to actually hurt more than help.
Yeah, I agree, is the short answer. The day that Greta Thunberg made her speech at the UN, the How Dare You speech, I spoke, shortly afterwards. Funnily enough, she got more attention. I think rightly enough, she got more attention. But one of the 3 points I made were exactly those about the green taxonomy, which is that, good idea, but the execution is crucial. We need 50 shades of green. We need that range of greens in order, and you've written about this, I know, in order to encourage the transition. The point is to take things from brown, olive towards green and get them there. Now, I think there's a rethink going on about the taxonomy. There's an opportunity as well, as in many things with the US, coming squarely into this climate discussion and setting up this framework, and we should grasp it in order to get a truly effective taxonomy. I'll make one other point, if I may, which is one of the challenges, I think, for central banks in terms of collateral policies and other things, and aligning those policies with the broader objectives as per the new Bank of England remit, objectives for sustainability, is the absence of that form of taxonomy, a third-party taxonomy that goes through the transition, as I think the question from the audience is suggesting.
Right. So you like the idea of a taxonomy from the EU, but you think they're going about it the wrong way. Is that?
I think it needs to be much richer. It needs, and this is a point that they won't be surprised to hear me say it. It's a point we've made to them over and over again, and many others have made to them, and we've made publicly. Obviously, it's the EU's decision what form of taxonomy they do, but for the market as a whole, it's exceptionally important to manage towards the transition. And I would say as well, what you see with leading asset owners, I should say. So some of the big insurance companies like AXA, Allianz, some of the big pension funds like CalPERS, Caisse de dépôt in Canada, what they're doing as part of a Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance is they are targeting specific carbon reductions of their portfolio, quite aggressive carbon reductions, 25 to 29%, not by some distant date, but by 2025, so 4 years from now. But they do that because they look across, including assets that are carbon intensive and are reducing that carbon intensity or the absolute emissions there quite substantially. And that's, we have to go to where the emissions are and get the emissions down, not only start at the end state of green investments.
Right. I often think that the EU taxonomy is a bit like the Basel rules for capital adequacy, in that they're so rigid they'll be arbitraged by the markets immediately anyway. So that's good.
Yeah, or they will. Well, yes, I think it's a longer longer debate to get the nuances of the analogy, but I get your point.
Right. And just one last quick question before I turn to other issues like fintech. Is the world moving fast enough yet to tackle climate change in your view? I mean, are you concerned that there's still far too little action?
I'm very encouraged by the action that's happened over the course of the last year, but as with everything with climate change, looking at the bigger picture, it still needs to move faster. Execution is going to be critical. Let me say as well, just to go finish off, we are on the cusp of having the core of the financial system make commitments to net zero. Not just distant 2050 plans, but more near-term plans and with greater transparency. It's important we get that right, but it's also important that we don't just have the words, but we have the high enough ambition that stretches from those asset owners that I just mentioned through asset management, banks, market infrastructure, insurers, and others. And that's one of the key objectives for Glasgow.
Right. Well, I'd like to switch tack now, because you wrote a fantastic piece for the Weekend FT about globalization, which I hope everyone's watching has read, which lays out your thoughts about globalization and the need for a much bigger type of structural change in the global economy. As part of that, technology is a key element of that, also fintech. And of course, you are now sitting on the board of Stripe. Before I ask a question, I'd really like to ask you, I mean, does it make you feel at all uncomfortable that you left public office and went into the private sector to sit on private sector boards? Because certainly inside the UK, there's been some sniping about how can you talk about the ills of market economy and then go and sit on the board of a...
Okay, first thing, let's go to the meta point, which is that I'm a huge believer in markets, and the issue is, do we set the objectives for those markets as a society? So we are doing that now, finally, belatedly, but finally, with net zero objectives for countries and policies which back that up. But to achieve these policies, we will need trillions of dollars in euros, pounds, pick your currency, it holds for all of them, in investment every year. And we're not going to get that from the public sector. We're going to get it from the market. Now, I've chosen the companies in the market with which I'm associated because they get that and they are towards the vanguard, if not at the vanguard of that. So Brookfield, one of their core strategies is a climate transition strategy, which I'm helping to lead. PIMCO, the same thing. And then Stripe, is part of this rewiring of the whole ecosystem of the economy, including for small businesses, a very entrepreneurial company that's helping entrepreneurs, helping to lower barriers, which I think is a good thing for globalization and inclusive growth. But also as part and parcel of that, they're pioneering a climate product, which basically allows for zero carbon fulfillment. And tackling in the process, we talked earlier about those breakthrough technologies. They're focusing on one of those critical breakthrough technologies, which is direct air carbon capture and abatement, as well as zero carbon steel, these things that really have to work for us ultimately to get there. So look, I believe in the market, but just to be clear, these are not, none of those companies did I oversee. I oversaw a lot of businesses as the governor of the Bank of England and at the FSB, but none of these companies I oversaw. And I'm not young anymore, but I'm not old, I'd like to think, and I want to be a productive member of society, and I view markets as having a role. So,
right. Well, let's take Stripe then. We have some questions about the environmental footprint of cryptocurrencies and fintech.
Yes.
Which I have written about a lot myself. I mean, lots of people would say that Bitcoin is absolutely filthy in terms of the amount of energy that it requires to do the mining, and much of that energy is actually not being generated in a sustainable way. The same thing could be thrown at AI, machine learning, natural language processing systems, or even other fintech platforms. Does that worry you? I mean, are we giving the tech companies too much of a free pass?
Well, we should first thing, I agree on Bitcoin, absolutely. And even if it's Bitcoin mined with renewable, that's displacing other renewable uses. So I agree on that. Particularly as I'm absolutely of the view that it will not be a currency or the constituent part ultimately of where the currency systems go. And I think that is much more likely, as I write in the FT piece, to be a central bank digital currencies and others. Secondly, in terms of the tech companies and the focus on their carbon footprint, and very importantly, their scope 3 carbon footprint, which captures everything, including their servers and the cloud and artificial intelligence and other aspects of what they do, that has to be there. And I think the best are going there and disclosing that and have objectives by 2030. But let me make an important point on machine learning and AI. So if you have machine learning AI, you have that developed and backed by renewable power. Remember as well that one of the biggest opportunities for carbon reduction actually comes from the application of machine learning and AI. Give you one example. There are a series of companies that are springing up, some big established and some new upstarts that look to optimize HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning for buildings, for commercial buildings. The potential savings there are at least a third on existing power and energy sources. So just optimizing the use, in ways that can be done with machine learning and AI and energy optimization. So this is part of the solution as well. But you have to follow it all the way through. I would say as well that there is one other point, which is not immediately, but prospectively, the integration of digital currencies, which I think in the end are going to be sourced from central banks, so central bank digital currencies, and also should be, not just will be, but should be, but linking those through fintech companies like Stripe and also through smart contracts can help us understand full carbon footprints and then optimize accordingly.
Right. I mean, the other question, which of course people are asking a lot about, is markets bubbles and froth in the markets. And something like the eye-watering valuation for Stripe that we reported on just the other day is one sign, some would say, of that froth valuation. Do you really think that the scale of digital transformation that's underway in the global economy justifies these sky-high, eye-popping valuations?
Well, I mean, there's always going to be exceptions to that. So I wouldn't give a blanket pass to valuations of anybody who has anything digital associated with them. If you're a very fast-growing company in a very fast-growing market, and that market is in effect the internet in its broadest sense, and your objective is to be at the heart of the growth of digital commerce, which is underpenetrated even at the peaks that we saw during the COVID crisis in the UK, for example, when retail, you got to 38% of retail spend being digital, but even that penetration is under penetration ultimately, and there's many advanced economies and emerging economies that will move in that direction. Then some valuations follow from that. But look, is there evidence of froth more generally in markets? Absolutely, and we see it in the SPAC boom, which I still think of as when I started out in finance, that those were known as blind pools, which wasn't quite as attractive a name as a special purpose acquisition company, but you see it in that. You see it in a range of valuations, and participants should take that into account. I mean, if I can put it back into an overall macro perspective, which is we're in a low interest rate environment, but many valuations are presuming growth that is inconsistent with that low interest rate environment. So there's a reconciliation that is going to come. I'd rather see the reconciliation be that growth picks up, that the returns from that growth are more evenly shared, so the profit share doesn't keep going to the moon, so it's more evenly shared with labor. And the consequence for valuations of that is you need to be robust and in a fast-growing market and taking market share.
But does it just concern you? I mean, this is the question in relation to your financial stability board role. I mean, I personally think SPACs, a lot of that looks absolutely bonkers. And I think a lot of what's happening right now looks bonkers given the valuations. Are you concerned we're going to have a very nasty bubble burst in the next few years? It's going to be potentially destabilizing for the global economy?
Yeah, I guess I distinguish between equity and equity excesses and systemic excesses. So when there's not leverage at the core, then one is less concerned, and there's fewer interlinks. So you can put money in a SPAC and lose money, and okay, that you've lost that money, but it doesn't have that amplification impact as well. I do worry from a company perspective is that you can end up with companies going public too soon, effectively orphaned in the capital markets. And, that does happen. People can say it doesn't, but it does happen. And it's ultimately not a good thing. I think where the concerns, I would say my concerns have been, and this was when I was governor and persisted with events since, has been in the asset management complex, and basically the on one hand, very positive development of the growth of market-based finance and asset management, but at the same time, the risks that come from daily liquidity that is to the investor, but the assets being invested in fundamentally illiquid assets, underlying assets. And, we saw extreme moves in that roughly this time last year. And you had to have extraordinary intervention by central banks, particularly the Fed, to stop that. Now, that's not, Fed did the right thing at the time, but that's not a viable system, or that's not the right way to run the system, to have the central bank come in and buy in the end. That's not being a market maker, that's being a buyer. That's a different thing. That's one reason why the Financial Stability Board now is taking what's called a holistic review of asset management. There's a variety of solutions to that. We can get into it more if you wish, but I think there does need to be a change there.
Is that a way of saying essentially the market infrastructure is broken and you don't have a way of effectively making markets in key asset classes unless a central bank is buying it?
I think
did you go too far with your bank regulation post 2007?
I don't think, no. Short answer, no on the bank regulation, and I'm certainly glad we went as far as we did, and we saw the banks, be part of the solution, not part of the problem this time last year when the crisis hit. But markets evolve, and market-based finance has grown. There's a lot of good in that, but I think more consistency between the liquidity of the underlying, the price at which you can redeem under stress, or the time period over which you can redeem that triangle, more consistency with that, and subject to that for asset pools, more direct access to central bank balance sheet for liquidity purposes. Think repo, not purchase. And that is a more robust system, more resilient system, where you preserve market pricing through it. You don't backstop market pricing with central bank pricing. So, markets will, this well, markets evolve, they always evolve, and the regulatory structure needs to evolve with them.
Right. Well, I want to ask one more quick question on that and then go back to green, because we're getting lots more questions about green linked to your book. The question really is do low interest rates cause the financial markets bubble and froth? Do you, as a former central bank governor, feel guilty for having contributed to this froth?
No, I don't feel guilty for having more people in work than would have been under a conceptually satisfying but economically and personally, individually damaging high interest rate environment for the sake of it, and also missing the central bank's remit, which is clearly specified in law and exceeding authority. No, I don't feel any guilt for that.
Right. Let's go back to green, because one thing is striking. It's a question from the audience. This is why I love asking for questions early on.
Yeah.
Are quite remarkable if you look back 2 or 3 years, because most of them are on green issues, which would have been unimaginable given you're a former central bank governor before. Yeah. And so a couple of ones, I've got a really interesting question here. Are the rating agencies paying enough attention to climate change in their ratings, say for rating an oil company 30-year bonds? Do you think they've actually woken up yet, the rating agencies, to these issues?
It's a fantastic question, and it's this. So part of the way the agencies have dealt with climate change is to develop a new assessment of transition risk, but not necessarily, in my judgment, fully integrating that transition risk into the credit rating. So the credit risk on the 30-year bond is the effectively the rating, and this is a. You gave a sort of a news flash about actually who writes books in the end at the start of our comments, which is interesting. Actually, it was news to me when you challenged me on. I was like, well, I thought everyone wrote their book, but and maybe I could have saved 6 months. That's probably
have a professional session with some of your counterparts at some point who've written books. Ask them how many of them actually had ghostwriters.
Oh dear. Okay. Anyways, but with rating agencies, as you know, but it's not always as clear, is the rating is supposed to be stable for 2 to 5 years. That's the different agencies have different perspectives. So even though they're rating a 30-year bond, they're not saying this is our best judgment on 30 years. They expect stability for that. And since the path of transition risk, which can be decisive for an energy company, absolutely decisive. I mean, huge potential stranded assets. It's not fully incorporated. So it puts the onus on the questioner, the investor, the market participants to not just take the credit rating, but to take an assessment of transition, which you can get from a third party, but ideally you're doing yourself. And this goes as well back to the heart of disclosure. So one of the issues for companies, not just energy companies, but an automaker, even a consumer goods company is, we should have disclosure of what's your assumption of the carbon price or the implied carbon price once you roll in regulation and other things over the course of the next 10 years? Do you have something that's consistent with, for example, in the UK, an economy that has emissions down 68%, which is the objective of the government? Tell us. And what would be the implications if actually the UK means what it says for your assets?
Right. Well, I think that's a very good question indeed. And I think carbon price eventually will become like the time value of money. It's something you just have to factor in. But we have so many questions. We only got about 2 minutes. We got questions about whether you think hydrogen is a hype, whether you think that what can be done to persuade consumers to switch to more expensive renewables when household budgets are being squeezed. Do you want to take that last one? How do we get British consumers or anyone else to actually embrace renewables? In a minute. Sounds like a BBC Radio 4 test.
How do we get them to embrace it? Partly through transparency. So there's a choice, and they, for those who have those values, they're able to make those decisions. By the way, we need more transparency in financial products, so we know whether or not our savings are being invested in line or not with net zero. But also through getting the price of renewables down, and the price of renewables continues to fall. The question, if I can do briefly on hydrogen, hydrogen has tremendous potential in a variety of applications. It's not clear to me, and that doesn't mean I'm right, that necessarily extends to vehicles, to autos and others, but in heavy industrial applications as a storage fuel for or as a storage mechanism is a better way to put it, for power, absolutely. And the prospects over the course of the next decade, I think, will be decisive in terms of when hydrogen, first blue, then green, comes in to become economic.
Right. Well, sadly, very sadly, we have to wrap up now. I'm sure most of our audience could have been talking all day about this because it's been fascinating. And the thing that's fascinating about you is that you are both have a grandiose vision laid out in your book, which, is, I'd say, a doorstopper that you did write yourself, but is very sweeping in its kind of manifesto. I have to ask, by the way, given you've written this manifesto, what next? Do you want to run something else? Fancy running Canada? Fancy running the UN? Any other multilateral bodies?
I try and run my household at this day. I mean, I have nothing else to say. I think that's the point.
Okay, well, lay out your manifesto. But I think what is striking is that as part of your manifesto, having been inside the belly of the beast of the financial system and policymaking community, one of your goals always was to try and change the conversation towards green. Judging by the questions today from the audience, you have succeeded in doing that really quite remarkably. So I'll simply say, on behalf of the FT, thank you very much indeed for coming along today. Thank you for the piece you wrote for the Week in FT. If anyone's watching hasn't read it, please do. And in the meantime, best of luck as you try and change the conversation around COP26. And please keep talking to us as you try and do that. So thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. And we'll be counting on the FT and all those listening to really make the difference.
Thank you.
Thanks.